And I wanted to say thanks to the Cascadia folks. This is really kind of an amazing conference. I think it's great that there's like families playing in the backyard and we get the view of the ocean. I'm psyched on all of that. So yeah, I'm Courtney Hemphill. I'm a developer. I've been a developer at Carbon 5 full stack for about 8 years. And I'm talking today about algorithms for animation. And the point of this talk is really to get around the core factors that are involved in animation from really both the design as well as the development side. And my intent with this talk is really twofold. I see a ton of sort of design on one side and development on the other side, and not a lot of sort of conversations happening in between. We sort of are lucky at the company that I work with because they sit together. They actually pair together. So we have developers and designers sitting next to one another and really pair developing the applications. And so they get to tweak things in the interface in a really dynamic fashion. And they've developed really a language around that. So my intent with this talk is to really figure out sort of how can you have a common language and how can you give developers, on one hand, sort of an understanding of design principles. And then from the design side, how can you give designers a little bit of power against producing something in a working interface. And I'm curious, I'm going to throw it to the audience, try to keep you guys awake. Who here is a designer, full-out designer? Sweet, okay, one person. Two? Who considers themselves to have design chops? Maybe you're a developer. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, I mean, everybody is a designer. I feel like I was a developer, my whole life. But I enjoy design. I'm not going to say that I'm a designer, and you'll notice that in my slides. But I like it. I tend to orient to the view, and I like to play around in the view layer. So that is something where I've been able to really have a lot of conversation with designers around what are sort of the processes that you use and the ideas. Who here feels like they are a full stack developer? And what I mean by that is, you really sort of go from the view all the way down to the server side. So it's a pretty good chunk, you guys. I kind of think it's the same thing with design. I think that there are designers that are never going to want to touch code. It's not the way that they really envision. But there are designers that really, they're sort of curious. They're like, well, what are these tools that I'm designing for, and how can I play around with them? So this talk is a little bit for them. But I'm going to start all the way back, years and years ago, talking about Disney. So a long time ago, there were these 12 guys. They called them the old men of Disney. But these were the first creators of animation. And it was cartoon animation. But they came up with 12 principles. And these principles were their way of translating our natural world into a pattern that you could use for cartoon animation. And so the method that they came up with was really sort of what we're used to. It's kind of the flip book, right? They would have their rock star designers come up with keyframes, and then they would have really the interns come in, and they would provide the frames in between those keyframes. And that became the cartoon. So what we know now is that those people that were creating those frames in between, those were the in-betweeners. So tweening became a thing back then. And what we do now with our software is that we have lots of algorithms that provide that tweening. They interpolate what is going to happen from one keyframe to the next. So speaking of dinosaurs, we're going to get ourselves a little cartoon here. This was the very first cartoon produced by Disney by a guy named Winsor McCay. And this is Gertie. And really, if you just look at sort of a straight static image of Gertie, she's not that interesting, but she became their first star. And she's pretty characteristic, She's got life, you have an emotional resonance with her, and everything just becomes a lot more interesting when you add motion to something. And the irony is that cartoons at that point in time were way more smooth in their motion than the Charlie Chaplin movies of the day. Those were very much frame-by-frame photography, and because of the technology at the time, they were very janky. So everybody knows about jank. Sort of interesting to see that manual cartoons could be made to be a lot more smooth than the photo representation. So animations really, they serve as cognitive aids. The traditional internet that we're used to and the patterns that we had, there was lots of text used in order to communicate to users how the heck they should progress through a website. And in today's world, we really are finding that motion is something that we humans innately respond to, and we can use that as a really powerful tool to get users to understand implicitly what we want them to do with the product that we're creating. And it can be a mobile site, it can be a website, it can be an app. But motion is the thing where users can really key in, and without us having a bunch of help bubbles and breadcrumbs, we can tell them how they can get through our interface. And so there's a lot of great resources now about patterns that you can use. Google Material Design is a great one, iOS design resources, and there's also Metro UI CSS that has some great patterns. But it all kind of comes down to what actually feels right to us. And it's all based in reality and what we sort of see to be natural objects in today's world. So Don Norman writes about this in his book, The Design of Everyday Things. And there's this notion of affordance. And really, affordance is really just how we understand something to have a physical property. So if you look at a chair, you know you can sit in it. You know it's going to be stable. You have 4 legs. You know if you pick it up by the back, it's probably going to swing because the chair is a little bit heavy on the seat. So these are sort of things that we afford to the chair. And those affordances also, they signify to us what we can use that object for. So the same thing can translate straight over into user interfaces. The best design is design where you don't have to tell people what to do. They can use the affordance of what they're looking at to signify to them what to do next. So motion is something that's really powerful when you do this sort of thing. And humans, we actually have sort of crap perception of color in our peripheral vision. So motion is something that when we load up a web page, you can scan through the center column and you can kind of find colors and patterns that you should probably key into. But in your peripheral vision, you pretty much ignore everything. Motion is something that can bring your vision exactly where you want your user to be. So it's an incredibly powerful tool to basically say, hey, look over here. This is sort of your next step. And animated transitions are also really great because you can give your user a sort of logical map of where things lie in the interface. So for example, in mobile phones, the whole notion of scrolling and swiping, you can actually navigate pretty effectively in most apps now in all different directions. And you know where to go. You know left is going to give me to this landscape and place, and right's going to get me to another one. So it's a really powerful way for us to do navigation without having this sort of like traditional drop-down. So I'm going to go through a couple of pretty common examples of what we see today. And this is something that we're all incredibly familiar with. It's, this is the autoloader that we all have seen in Pinterest. And it's really just sort of a fun way for us to be able to load in new content without having to reload the page. The ability for people right now to be patient is pretty much zero. So having them be able to play with interfaces and figure out that there's sort of this animating playfulness that they can experience and explore the interface as opposed to having to wait for things to load. If you can keep your user doing something, they're likelier to stay on your site for a longer period of time. And then the other thing is motion can really enhance a brand as well, and it can give user immediate feedback. So we're telling our user really quickly here something very blatant. You're wrong. I get it. Totally stated. But if you tell them in a manner that's a little bit more playful, it's that much more enhancing to the brand. It's that much more playful with the user. They're a little bit more engaged with what you're doing with them. And then navigation is the great one. It's who here has seen a breadcrumb in a website in like the past month, let's say? Still? Jesus. Okay. Well, I want the death of breadcrumbs to happen. The hamburger menu is another thing that probably is going to have its day and then probably go away. But the idea of navigation, this is something where like humans, we have this ability to map out and find context. So if you can allow your users to explore your site rather than sort of like force a structure on them, they're going to have more fun, and it's likely that they're going to be more engaged in continuing to use your site. So navigation, this is something that we all see. This is sort of the old school, you jump from one page to another, you know how to get back to it, but giving someone a little bit more of a context about where they're going, and I sort of alluded to it before, with mobile apps now being able to swipe in different directions, giving them, again, sort of this overall cartography of where things lie. Super powerful. So this is the one that I actually love. Reducing cognitive load on your users is huge. Just don't show me anything that I don't care about right now. You can actually ask your users for a ton of information. I mean, we've done apps where it's like bringing in people through these completely huge funnels of they're applying for a loan, and they've got to put in all this information. They're actually not that against putting that information in as long as you only tell them what they need to know in real time. So really sort of that reducing the cognitive load and allowing them to understand, okay, what am I entering? When do I need to do it? Telling them when they're wrong, but in a friendly manner. These are the things that will get them to continue moving forward. And one of the things we found with this app that we were developing for the loan application was we initially tried to design with all these different images on it, and it was really beautiful, but then we split tested it A/B with this idea of just a piggy bank filling up as they moved through this funnel, and they loved it. The piggy bank was just this one tiny little icon, but everyone loved watching the piggy bank fill up. So context is the final one, and this is really just keep your users continually informed. Let them know if you're making them wait for any matter of time, let them know why they're waiting. So I thought this was originally done by Tweety, but then Twitter obviously bought them and took it over, but it was patented. And pulling down and knowing that content is loading, and they tell you that, loading the content, and then letting you know if there is no content. Super quick motion by the user. They don't have to do a lot, but you give them a lot of information back. So that continuity and pace, keeping your users sort of entertained. People have also likened this to sort of the pulling of the lottery, the slot machine, and being able to get that that feedback loop. Sort of we're now in this pattern where it's like we can scroll to our heart's content with Instagram, and we just love it because we're continually given sort of that bonus. So how do you communicate? These are ideas that are existing right now. These are patterns that are pretty well known. There's tons of ideas out there about how we can improve our interfaces with motion. So how do you communicate those as a designer that probably isn't playing with code? And the reality is it's just with a little bit of math and having an underlying notion of what the actual patterns are with animation and how you can communicate with developers about how you want to speed something up or slow it down or easing it in or out. All that can be communicated really easily, and you can even play around with it in the browser in an easy fashion. So I am definitely not good at math. I'm a developer, but I would not be the one writing crazy algorithms. And there are insane algorithms that people write for animation. But really, it's very simple, sort of the one core formula that you need for animation. And this is not it. So what this is actually the most simplistic way that you can move things. And in this way, okay, we're animating, but this is definitely a very frame-by-frame thing, and we need to give this formula so much information. Where do you start? Where are you going? What exactly are you changing? This is, pixel-based, and we just don't have a lot of power to alter this function. So we are achieving the end to the means that we want. We're animating something, but we really can't manipulate this very much. And it certainly is a rather boring version of motion. So interpolation is the core of animation, and it's really this whole idea of percent change. So to make things appear realistic, interpolation is the algorithms behind creating things in a much more organic fashion. So people have used really wacky algorithms, interpolation algorithms, to do things like make individual pieces of a face move in different ways in cartoons. And they'll even do this for hairs, individual hairs in movies these days will actually have different algorithms behind their movement. And it's all in an effort to make things look more organic and make them look more like reality. And again, it's just based on this idea of the change that we want to have happen, and then the percent complete. So we're breaking everything down to something that can be measured against this range from 0 to 1. So if you take a number between 0 and 1 and you multiply it by another number between 0 and 1, you sort of get this magic thing. It's still a number between 0 and 1. So we can now do a lot with this function. We can slot in different things. We can change not just distance, we can do shape, we can do morphing, we can do color changes. Now all of a sudden we can use this one formula, and we're still making a really quite boring animation, but you'll see that we can now start to make this a little bit more interesting. And the reason that this is boring is because we are just doing a linear animation. And we all know that it's not something that we see very often. Linear movement is really the exception in our world. And I love this term. This is Stanislas Ulam was the guy that really, they credit as being sort of the originator of nonlinear science. So it was him and Fermi and John Pasta. They came up with this notion of, or they started really the study of nonlinear science. But he has this great quote, which is, using a term like nonlinear science is like referring to the bulk of zoology as the study of non-elephant animals. So we can all really recognize that reality, it's organic. Our natural sort of measure of the world, it includes torque, it includes things like friction and drag. You're never going to see something move like the animations I just showed unless it's in a frictionless vacuum, which, frankly, on Earth is not a thing. So we experience yaw, torque, et cetera, all of these things. And interestingly enough, physics can really have us be able to mimic that same thing using easing functions and using these different algorithms for that interpolation bit. So literally, we're starting at the same beginning, and we're ending at the same place, but we're just changing the rate at which we're progressing through that 0 to 1 range. So changing in the property times some float. So that some float is where we just shove in our interpolation algorithm. And so that float can get super interesting, and that we give it a beginning value, but it completely changed the way in which we see the animation happen. So now we start to put in some sort of more interesting functions there. We're going to put some power functions in. And this is our Ferrari. So we get to zoop, see a little bit more of an interesting animation. And who doesn't love a Ferrari? But that actually is kind of jarring. One of the things they say in Google Material Design is if you have something in or a screen and it's speeding in and then just stopping right in front of you, it's actually a little bit awkward. It feels a bit weird, and the users are probably going to have kind of a natural reaction against it. So oftentimes, this is the one that we see a lot more. This is the easing in. So again, it's not the most exciting thing, but this is underlying all of the frameworks that you maybe have used and most of the animation on the internet of any of these sliding in, easing out. And the other thing is, it can start to get even more interesting. So although that doesn't look dramatically different, these are the things where you can actually have brand guidelines around the specific algorithms that you're using for the motion in your interface. And the devil is definitely in the details. You can have things that look a little too jarring to a user, and you can change something very subtly, and it'll make them feel like it's a much more natural motion. So the other thing that is pretty fun is this whole notion of follow-through. So I talked previously about the Disney sort of 12 animation, now I'm totally forgetting it, effectively 12 ways that you should think about motion and the ways that you can translate them into interfaces. Follow-through is one of them. So I've been talking about this idea of that 0 to 1 range being a thing. You can actually go beyond that 0 to 1, and this gives you the notion of follow-through. So much like in our everyday world, you're not always moving and just stopping at a place. Oftentimes, you maybe go back, and so you need a little bit of elasticity that you're introducing to your elements. So in this scenario, you'll see our algorithm there is getting a little bit more complicated. And so you might be like, well, how do I figure out which algorithm does what? There are tons of places on the internet that will give you these different algorithms that you can slot in. And the great thing is that this is the exact same function that I'm using over and over again. You can start to put in some really crazy algorithms, and you can also do it in a patterned way. So you can actually not only come up with guidelines for a user interface that have to do with font size and color palette and line space. You can actually create this whole notion around what are the different sort of motion interactions that can happen. And you can build these into either a CSS framework or a JavaScript framework, so people can really slot these in. So we've done projects before where maybe there's this really intense code base underneath the product that we're working on, but you can create these kind of nice prototyping layers by just creating a kit of parts around all of the things that I've talked about. If it's font, if it's color, if it's these different visual elements, and animation should now be one of those elements. And it's giving both designers and sort of the front-end team all of the tools that they need to start to play around with how they can slot in these different elements and really keeping with the same constraints that'll be represented across the whole interface. So elasticity gets to be pretty fun. And again, there's a way to use animation and there's a way to not. So much like the blink tag, if you have bounce everywhere, it's really going to start to get annoying to your users. So there's a place to use animation, and there's a place where it feels good, and there's a place where it starts to feel awkward, and then there's the whole uncanny valley thing. So testing with your users is huge, and there's a lot of different ways that you can put interfaces in front of people and just get their insight. So we oftentimes do user testing, and we'll bring people in and we'll basically be like, how does this feel? Does it feel cohesive? And honestly, that whole thing I was talking about before, you can provide a lot of different tests to users to see if they can intuitively figure out your navigation and your interface independent of any direction. So something that's often interesting for us is A/B tests against different sort of dynamic elements that you can introduce and figuring out which ones users innately just go to and which ones they completely ignore. And something that's really common on mobile now is it's really a pain in the butt, particularly with all the different device sizes, to actually find the buttons with your thumb. It's a lot easier if you can do this swipe thing. And it's tricky right now because obviously mobile is going to be a lot different than your website. But if you have a mobile app that you're working on, trying to use swipe and motion of the user's thumb more than directing their thumb somewhere, it's just a much more natural interaction, and they love to explore with it. That's just something that we've sort of found. So this thing always tends to stop playing right when I get to the slide. But this was something that was created by one of the developers, not me, at Carbon 5. But what he did was he used all those functions that I just showed. He used sort of a compendium of them to create this thing that sort of looks like, anyone can guess what this kind of looks like? Birds on a wire. So the natural interactions of the birds, he did, a lot of this was just figuring out sort of like how close they were with one another, and then having these functions just happen to where they would sort of bounce off each other. And he ended up tweaking with this for quite some time, but he came up with this feeling that these are actually birds, that they're flying in flocks, that when they hit one another, they sort of have this natural interaction and they kind of bounce away. So I'm going to talk really quickly about some tools. So I want to reiterate that, and there's not a ton of designers in this audience, but oftentimes I've given this talk at design conferences, and it's like, well, I don't really want to have to deal with those algorithms. There is still a ton of tools that you can use to really initially prototype out interactions, motions, animations in an interface without having to touch code. And these are some good ones that I've seen art designers use. And you can use this. You can use this in the way in which you're sort of doing that big picture, like how do I want some of these animations to work? And then these can actually start to get ported into code. So oftentimes this is either one of the designers that likes to dive into CSS and JavaScript, and they'll sort of port that over. Or this is literally a developer sitting down with the designer and pulling these things into CSS. These, again, are great materials to use, though. The Material Design Lite, they have a whole section on animations, and they've got great sort of constraints for you if you need the constraints, but they also have ways that you can really flex it. So I highly recommend checking that one out. And honestly, CSS animations are dead easy. I mean, most of the code is pretty much already written for you, and they're very easy to drop in an interface. I'll talk a little bit about sort of the trade-offs between JavaScript and CSS, but here are some of the frameworks that we actually have used at Carbon 5. I'd say the one that has probably been seen to be the most performant is GSAP. It's also pretty intense. You're diving pretty deep once you get into GSAP. The Tween.js and Framer.js, those are a little bit more lightweight. And then the performance thing. So there's continual conversations around what's better, JavaScript versus CSS for performance. And the answer is it's sort of like, it depends. So CSS can be great if what you're doing is literally just shaking a button or sliding something in. If you need to have that tethered to some sort of reaction that's going to happen on another element, then you should start looking into JavaScript. But you can really play around a lot with just CSS, and that's going to be probably the most performant thing. So that's what I have to say. Please go forth and animate. If you have any comments against this talk, or if you have any additional things to add, I would love to hear them. I'll be around today and tomorrow. So thank you so much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the conference.